Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about neurons and nerve signaling. The first thing we need to do before we start talking about neurons is think about how the nervous system is organized in the human body. The nervous system is first broken down into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system has two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is a little bit more complex. It has what's called the sensory nervous system and the motor nervous system. The sensory is the afferent side. It's the side that is sending information towards the central nervous system. The motor is the opposite. The motor is the efferent side. It's sending information from the central nervous system out into the periphery. Now, within the sensory side, there are both somatic and autonomic branches. That word somatic just refers to certain voluntary sensory functions. These somatic nerves tend to influence skin, muscle, bones, joints. The autonomic branch is the involuntary branch. These nerves tend to influence primarily the viscera. So they're carrying sensory information from the different internal organs towards the central nervous system. Now, within the autonomic, there is a breakdown into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic referring to the sort of involuntary responses that are fight or flight. You've probably heard that expression related to the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic is the opposite, and sometimes it's referred to as the feed and breed system. So not so much related to the stress of fight and flight, but in the more relaxed state, the feed and breed state. Now, if you look at the motor system, again, the efferent side, the effect side, signals coming out of the central nervous system being carried along motor nerves to elicit some kind of effect. That too can be broken down into somatic and autonomic, and within the autonomic, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So it's the same organization, it just affects different tissue types. The somatic motor nerves tend to impact skeletal muscle. The autonomic motor nerves tend to impact things like glands and cardiac muscle in the heart and smooth muscle throughout the body. So, the first thing that's critical to our understanding of how the cells of the nervous system function is to understand how the nervous system is organized. Now, the way I've described the organization of the nervous system is only one way to look at it. On this slide, you can see it laid out slightly differently. The information is the same, but it's described in a slightly different hierarchy. If you start at the top, you can see this is describing the organization of the entirety of the nervous system. And the first thing we do is we break it into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system being where sensory information comes in, some decision is made about how to react to that sensory information, and that decision is sent out to have some kind of an effect. So, brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. Everything else is part of the peripheral nervous system. And you can see on this chart, they've broken down first into somatic, which is again voluntary, and autonomic. And then they've shown that within those two branches of the peripheral nervous system, you can have both afferent and efferent nerves. So another way to look at that is within the voluntary side of the peripheral nervous system, some of those voluntary nerves are carrying information toward the central nervous system, and some are taking it away from the central nervous system out towards effector tissues. The same is true of the autonomic or involuntary peripheral nervous system. There are nerves that carry information towards the central and nerves that take information away from the central. And of course, we can break down further the involuntary side of the peripheral nervous system into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So, if you were to draw this information out as a chart, it would look slightly different from this chart. But the actual information would be the same. It's just a slightly different way of describing this breakdown. And in both cases, you can see that it's the peripheral nervous system that is the more complex, that has the more components associated with it, because it's first and foremost divided into an autonomic or an involuntary type of system, and a somatic or a voluntary system. And then within both of those, we can look at afferent versus efferent. We can look at sympathetic versus parasympathetic. It's just more complex in its divisions. But it turns out it doesn't matter where you are in the nervous system, whether you're in the central nervous system or the peripheral or any place within the peripheral nervous system. When you're in the nervous system and you zone in on cells, there are two types of cells that make up this very complex system. And those cell types are the neurons themselves and what we call glial cells, or supportive cells around the neurons, the cells that help the neurons do their job effectively. So a neuron can be one of three types. It can be a sensory neuron. Remember, that's the afferent side. That's the kind of neuron that is going to take information about the environment, about the body itself, and send it along to the central nervous system. Then there are motor neurons, and those are the efferent variety. Those are the neurons that are receiving information from the central nervous system and sending that information back out to the body for a response to happen. And finally, there's a category called the interneuron. And interneurons are kind of fascinating because interneurons are essentially helping to get the message to its destination. We'll talk more about each type of neuron in just a minute. The glial cells within the nervous system are one of four types. There are what we call astrocytes, there are microglial cells, There are oligodendrocytes, and there are Schwann cells. And again, we're going to talk about each one of these separately. Let's start by looking at the basic structure of a neuron. A neuron is an unusual looking cell. It doesn't have that simple sort of spherical, rounded shape that we expect to see in an animal cell, right? It has a very unusual anatomy. The membrane of a neuron is extended into some unusual projections, including one very long one shown here. So when we think about the very general anatomy of a neuron, and different types of neurons are going to have slightly different anatomy. But when we think about the general anatomy, we can describe a cell body. That's the primary part of the cell. This is where the nucleus of the cell is going to be found, and the organelles, the mitochondria and the ER and the Golgi apparatus, all of the organelles that we've talked about so far. There are membrane extensions coming off of the cell body that we call dendrites. And what makes a dendrite is the fact that it is going to be in communication with other cells. It's going to be receiving information from these other cells. And then finally, there's this elongated extension called the axon. The axon, too, is going to be in communication with other cells. But unlike the dendrites, the axon is going to be sending information to those other cells. And you can see at the end of the axon, there are these branches. Those are going to become very important as we talk about the function of this neuron, and particularly the axon. And you'll notice that at the ends of these terminal branches, there are these sort of enlargements, these sort of swellings. Those are going to become important too as we think about and talk about the function of this neuron. So let's take a minute and talk about the three different types of neurons. So these are, again, the three categories of neurons that you can find throughout the nervous system. There are sensory neurons, there are motor neurons, and there are interneurons. The sensory neurons are receiving information from the environment and from the internal workings of the body, and they are sending that information toward the central nervous system. Remember, we said some of these sensory neurons are going to be the somatic type, the voluntary type, and some are going to be the autonomic or the involuntary type. So what kinds of information do sensory neurons pick up on? Well, if you think about the word senses, they're picking up on things like the kinds of objects that we see, the kinds of things we smell, the things that we hear, that we touch, things like pressure, things like pain, things like temperature, even things like stretch and tension in internal organs can be picked up by these sensory neurons. Remember, some of them are somatic, some of them are on the voluntary side of things, and others are autonomic. We don't have to think about this stuff. This information is being received by the sensory neurons without us even really being aware of it. Now, motor neurons are taking information from the central nervous system and carrying it out to the periphery, to the body, to the responding tissues. The central nervous system integrates all of the sensory information coming in, and sends out commands along the motor nerves. Again, some are somatic, some are autonomic. And these responses are generally involving muscle, both skeletal and smooth muscle, and glands. So endocrine glands, the kinds of glands that secrete hormones, and exocrine glands, the glands that secrete other types of substances. Now, the last on the list is the interneuron. What the interneuron does is connect one neuron to another neuron. So an interneuron is receiving information from one neuron and passing it along to another neuron, sort of filling in the gaps in the pathways, both towards the central nervous system and then back away from the central nervous system. Now, these are the three breakdowns in the types of neurons that we find in the nervous system. But it's important to know that the anatomy of these neurons, how they literally look, is going to differ from place to place to place in the body. So sensory neurons that occur in different parts of the body may have a slightly different anatomy. Motor neurons that occur in different parts of the body are going to have a slightly different anatomy depending on where they lie. Because as we've talked about before, the shape of a cell is going to be critical to the way that cell functions. Now, let's shift gears here and take a look at the glial cells. Glial cells are a really fascinating group of cells. Believe it or not, historically, we used to believe that glial cells were really just sort of holding together the rest of the nervous system. We actually believed that they were just acting like glue. They were just holding together all of the neurons so that they could function. We now understand through decades and decades of research that glial cells do much more than this, and they are critical to the function of the nervous system. Glial cells are found in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But within the central nervous system, glial cells actually outnumber neurons. Glial cells are the most abundant type of cell in the brain and the spinal cord. This term glia just means glue. These cells got their name because we used to think that they were just holding everything together. But we now understand they do much more. Now, microglial cells, this first category of glial cells, these are actually an immune cell. They are the immune cell of the nervous system. Microglial cells are phagocytic cells. So they are capable of performing phagocytosis and taking in and destroying any type of material that does not belong in the nervous system. So infectious cells, infectious particles, and also any kind of debris that is foreign and doesn't belong there. The microglial cells will take it in through phagocytosis and dismantle it. Astrocytes are probably the most fascinating of the glial cells. They have many different functions, and we really don't understand them completely, even in 2020. One of the things that astrocytes do is modulate synapses. Now, we haven't talked about synapses yet, but for now, think of a synapse as just being a connection point between two neurons or between a neuron and another type of cell. So astrocytes are going to help modulate what's happening at that connection point, and they're going to alter or influence the strength of the signal that is being sent from one cell to the other at a synapse. Astrocytes are believed to play a role in chronic pain. Chronic pain, if you're not familiar with it, is its own disease process. Chronic pain is a type of pain that lasts and lasts beyond its effective use. The pain itself becomes the disease in chronic pain. And it's believed that astrocytes and a dysfunction of astrocytes is actually what's playing a role in chronic pain. Finally, astrocytes make up what's called the blood-brain barrier. So astrocytes actually surround the brain and have great control over what can access the tissues of the brain from the blood. So in order for a substance to come out of the blood and gain access to brain cells, they have to pass through astrocytes. So astrocytes greatly restrict what can go into the brain. And if you think about it, that's critically important. You would not want anything to get access to the central nervous system, the brain at least, without a necessity. So it turns out that many things simply cannot gain access to the brain very readily because of this blood-brain barrier. This can be actually problematic for us in medicine because there are several types of drugs that we would love to use and deliver to the brain, but that have a really difficult time getting into any therapeutic level in the brain because of this barrier created by the astrocytes. Next on our list are the oligodendrocytes and the Schwann cells. Now we talk about these two cell types together because they have a similar function. Both oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells form what's called myelin sheaths. Now these are layers of fatty material that will be laid down over the surface of axons to influence how signals are transmitted along axons. The only difference between oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells is their location. The oligodendrocyte is the cell that forms the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, and the Schwann cell is the type of cell that forms myelin sheaths in the peripheral nervous system. Now, it's important to know that not all neurons have a myelin sheath around their axon. Only some are myelinated, others are unmyelinated, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. If you look at this image at the bottom of this slide, you can see how these myelinating cells function. What's being depicted down at the bottom, this yellow line right here, represents an axon. So you have to imagine that there's a nerve cell body up here and dendrites extending from that nerve cell body. And here's that axon carrying signal from the nerve cell body down to the next cell, whether that next cell is a neuron or a muscle cell or perhaps a gland. Now what you're looking at in blue here is myelin. They've cut away a portion of the myelin here, and they've cut it in lengthwise here, so that we can see that this myelin is laid down in layers around the axon. Myelin is a very fatty substance, and it gets laid down in layer after layer. Notice too that it's not laid down in one continuous sheath around the axon, but rather in these individual areas here, multiple individual areas. And that's because it's being produced and laid down by cells. So what you're looking at up at the top here is again this axon in yellow, but this time we're looking at it in cross section. So we've come through along the length here and we've cut it, and now we're looking at it end on. Now notice that there's a cell that has wrapped itself around most of the circumference of that axon. We happen to be out in the periphery here, so this is a Schwann cell. So here's the cytoplasm of the cell in this light purple color. Here's the nucleus. It's just like any other cell. It's just specialized to secrete this fatty myelin material. And if you look over here in the next diagram, they're showing us that process. This cell lays down myelin in layers. You can see that as you go from here over to here, this cell has completely wrapped itself around this neuron, and it's going to secrete this material that creates the myelin sheath. On this slide, we're looking at a drawing of an oligodendrocyte. And this oligodendrocyte is also creating myelin sheath. It's just doing it in the central nervous system, not the peripheral nervous system. Now we can see a neuron here in yellow. Looks a lot like that neuron I showed you a few minutes ago. It's got a cell body on one end with a nucleus, dendrites emerging from extensions of the membrane. Here's this singular axon that has terminal branches at the end. A typical sort of generic looking neuron. You can just see the axon of another neuron over here. The oligodendrocyte, remember, is not a neuron. It is a glial cell. And like the Schwann cell, it's going to secrete myelin. It just does it a little differently. Rather than sitting over and around the axon by itself, what an oligodendrocyte does is send out membrane extensions. And those membrane extensions wrap around the axon. And those membrane extensions are where the myelin is being secreted and layering over the axon. So it's doing it a little bit differently than the Schwann cell does, but the idea is the same. This is a cell that is producing myelin and secreting myelin in layers around the axon of neurons. On this slide, we're looking at a drawing of a neuron here with its cell body and its dendrites and an axon. This happens to be a myelinated axon. Here are the terminal branches coming off the end of the axon with the swellings at the end. I like this drawing because it's side by side with a scanning electron microscope image of an actual neuron. So here's the cell body of this neuron, and here are all of these membrane extensions. Now you can't see other cells in this particular shot, but there are other nerve cell bodies or neuron cell bodies that are just outside of our view that this neuron is communicating with. I can't tell you for sure, but this is most likely the axon right here, traveling off to communicate with another cell. You really get the feeling from this SEM image just how complex this system could become because of all of these membrane extensions. There's lots and lots of communication points between a neuron and other cells. Now, if we take a look at the drawing a little more closely, you can see some of the structures that we need to be familiar with. We've already talked about some of these. Again, the cell body is where the machinery of the cell lies. The nucleus and all of the other organelles are found in the cell body. The dendrites are simply extensions of the membrane. And dendrites can be very complex. They can themselves branch out. It depends on the neuron. Some neurons have very few, even singular dendrites. Other cells have many, many, many branched dendrites and are in communication with lots and lots of other cells. The important thing to remember is that what the dendrite does that is different from what the axon does is the dendrite receives information. The axon carries information away and sends it along its way. Now, if we go down this axon, this is a myelinated axon. And you can see these sort of cotton ball white structures that are sitting all along the length of the axon. This is the myelin sheath. There are cells that are secreting this myelin in layers and layers and layers, but remember, it's not continuous. So in between each one of these white cotton balls, there is a place, a space that doesn't have myelin on it. That's important. We call those spots nodes, and specifically nodes of Ranvier. Those are going to be critically important when we talk about how electrical signals are propagated along axons. So they're showing us that there are individual Schwann cells that are secreting myelin at each of these discrete locations along the length of this neuron